So in relation to the lack of trust, what I can say is that, using Tunisia as an example, okay? So in Tunisia, the lack of trust was very, very marked. I don't know if you followed, or I don't know what the coverage was like in Italy when the election took place in Tunisia at the end of 2011. But when the results were published, the Islamist party got 39% of the vote, and that was the largest component. And the second largest was significantly lower. So they were a minority, but they were the largest party. A lot of the coverage was very positive because people were very happy that such a great electoral process took place, and it was very diverse and no violence. People were very happy. Tunisians were very happy. But some of the coverage was very, very negative, saying that's it, we're going to become an Islamic theocracy now. It's over. Let's pack our bags and move to France. And then the coverage in France was extremely negative. It was very, very, very negative, and it impacted afterwards the way in which some of the secular people in Tunisia perceived their own country. Okay. And also you started seeing suddenly in Tunisia for the first time women covering their faces, okay? And many people said, oh, well, you see, this means that the Gulf monarchies are influencing our culture and our society, whereas in fact, Tunisian women used to cover their faces before the dictatorship started, okay? Not some, very few did, but it was something that existed in Tunisian culture too. So this, all this is this, constituting layer over layer of lack of trust. But what's happened now since the constitutional process started is that many of the parties have made significant concessions towards each other, sometimes without asking for anything in exchange. So one of the first things that happened in Tunisia is that the another party promised immediately not to have any reference to Sharia in the constitution, without asking for a concession in return. Okay, that contributed to a significant boost of trust within the country, and many other concessions have been made over time, and to a certain extent. Although there's still, polarization in Tunisia, to a certain extent, many people who are originally very, very opposed to Nahda are getting closer, to accepting the constitution. So I can name some examples of Yal Ben Ashur, who's a prominent professor of administrative law in Tunisia, and played a very important role during the first year of the revolution in Tunisia. He was very, very opposed immediately to the whole constitutional process and to the first drafts, and just thought the whole thing was a disaster. Now he's much more willing to accept the text. He says, there's a lot that we would change, he says, but there's a lot that I can work with, so he's a lot happier. And having him come over, even though he was very, very opposed, from a very secular perspective, now he's much more, willing to accept it. So that's a good illustration of, concessions being helpful in that regard. Whether or not the reference to religion can fosters trust or doesn't foster trust, I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the country, right? So in a country like Tunisia, the secular, liberal, left-wing camp is really a very big component of the country. It's probably the majority. Okay, so for them to have an explicit reference to Sharia would not have been acceptable. So the concession was helpful in that regard. In Libya, they're very conservative. Libyans are very, very conservative. I don't know if people have spent any time in Libya, but you never see women walking alone in the street or even walking in groups in the street. Not because they're repressed, but it's just not done. It just doesn't happen. And Libyans are generally very, very conservative. So I would expect that people in Libya would probably want for there to be a reference to religion in their constitution, at least the most part. And I have some opinion polls that were carried out recently by Libyan institutions that would suggest that that's the case. In Egypt also, it's very difficult to imagine that any future constitution, at least in the near term, would not have a reference to religion, because Egyptians are also very, very religious. Christians and Muslims alike are very religious. So within that context, I don't think the reference to religion is necessarily the problem, but what it means for the way in which your individual liberties are impacted. Whether or not religion will be used to repress, which is the concern. And although some of the provisions relating to religion changed in the constitution, but generally the framework is mostly the same. The major difference in Egypt isn't what the constitution says, but who's saying it. Okay. So now that because it's the Muslim Brotherhood that's saying it, people are very worried. Okay. There are provisions, for example, there's Article 10 in the Constitution, which says that the state will provide assistance to women in balancing their relationship with the family and their work. Okay. So it sounds terrible, right? It sounds like this awful provision where the state is going to force women to work and force them to be mothers and daughters and that type of thing, and look after their parents and their kids, and men don't have to do anything, right? Whereas in fact that provision is copied and pasted from the 1971 Constitution. And at the time, no one thought that it was such a big deal, right? Because it was a different regime that was saying it. Now, because it's the Muslim Brotherhood that put it in the constitution, people understand it in a very, very different way. Okay? So it's not necessarily the reference to religion, but just the context in which religion is being used or being discussed. You also asked about the Constitutional Court. Yes, so the answer to that question is the idea for Article 4 is that whenever Sharia is an important issue for Parliament or the courts, that they should ask, and that's for its opinion. But that's always been the case in the past. So the Constitutional Court would ask in the past for the Azhar's opinion. It's not always, but where there was something that they really didn't know the answer to, they would ask them for their opinion. So in my view, it doesn't really change much, or perhaps it doesn't change anything. I'm not really sure, but so far I can't really see any differences. Okay. The Gulf countries are using their influence, their financial weight, and their presence in media, to guide and to influence the processes. Okay, it doesn't mean that they can control everything. Certainly the Gulf monarchies weren't in favor of the revolutions to start with. They certainly were not in favor of deposing Ben Ali, Gaddafi, and Mubarak to start with. So they don't control everything. They were opposed to the war in Iraq. They're heavily opposed to the regime in Syria. But so far they haven't been able to depose it. It doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. So they don't control everything, but they do have an impact. Okay. Now whether or not the Noor party shifts from one side to the other, I'm not sure that's really going to have an impact on the relationship with Saudi Arabia, particularly because the Noor party is not really aligned with Saudi Arabia's ideology. The Noor party is heavily religious. For those people who don't know, the Noor party in Egypt is a Salafi party. And Salafis are puritanical Muslims who live according to what they believe to be the way in which the Prophet Muhammad lived his life. But the main distinction with the Noor party in Egypt is that they really represent the very, very low economic classes in Egypt, and there are many of them, as opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, which represents middle class religious people. Okay, and Saudi Arabia isn't really a pro-poor regime, right? That's not really their angle. Their angle isn't to allow poor people to become wealthy. That's not the idea. So they're not really ideologically aligned. I would say that what will probably influence Egypt's relations with the Gulf monarchies will be its liquidity crisis. This is a major problem for them, and they're desperately in need of cash. And even Iraq, my country, has made an important deposit of several $1 billion in Egypt's central bank, for that purpose, because they know that Egypt needs the money, and they have a lot of additional cash. So why not use it? Let's use this money to influence Egyptian foreign policy, right? Or even their national policy. That hasn't really had an impact yet, but we'll see. But the liquidity crisis, I'd say, will play more of an impact on their relations with the Gulf monarchies. And whether or not they go fully revolutionary and really, go the full route of completely changing their social structure within the country, their constitutional structure, will also impact their relations with the Gulf monarchies. Because if they do, then they will no longer have their support. If Egypt goes the fully revolutionary route and completely reforms their society, the Gulf monarchies will absolutely not support that. They are not in favor of revolution anyway. So it's unlikely that they would support that type of move. I don't know how many of you know about the Tunisian president, but Monsef Marzouki is a human rights activist, had lived a long time in exile, and was in exile and was also imprisoned and went through lots of trouble. While he was in exile in France, he was faced with a situation where Ben Ali was modifying the constitution just in order to increase his own personal hold on power. Okay? So the constitutional mechanism was all legal. Everything that was being done was done according to the proper mechanisms, right? But it was all done for a very selfish purpose, which was in order to make sure that he would remain in power. Okay? So in exile, Mansur Marzouki and others were asking themselves, what recourse do I have? What type of recourse do I have? You know, I can't bring a claim before the Tunisian courts, first of all, because they wouldn't let me. But even if I did, the courts would probably answer that everything was happening legally, right? These changes are not illegal, they're happening according to the proper procedures, okay? You know, I can't have, there's no international jurisdiction that would allow me to bring claims, because they would answer the same thing. And anyway, there isn't even a court that I can turn to. And international pressure won't help because everyone's allied with Ben Ali, right? So he's saying, I have no recourse. There's nothing that I can do apart from talk and issue videos and write articles, which won't lead me anywhere, right? Okay. So now that he's present, he's trying to resolve that problem for his country, perhaps in the future, in case they regress once again, or for other countries. And the solution that they're proposing is a new court, a new international jurisdiction, okay, that they're arguing in favor of. So the president has now tabled this motion function and what rules they would apply. You know, because there's the question is, would they apply the national constitution's rules, or would they apply some type of international norm? You know, is there an international right to democracy? That's something that some people have been talking about for a very long time, right? And the answer to that is, we don't know. You know, if there is, then what would we do about countries like China? You know? So that's still something that's being debated, and that's something that we debated during our conference, and we didn't have a consensual view about that. But it's something that's going to be talked about again, and will be tabled officially at the General Assembly meeting in September this year, and hopefully will be sent to the International Law Commission, the ILC, so that they could also within a few years propose a detailed motion about that, a detailed proposal. Okay. So perhaps, you know, this might lead to some new jurisdiction, not in the near future, but perhaps maybe in 10, 15 years, perhaps. You know. Certainly the president of Tunisia is very much in favor. In terms of Morocco, in summary, yes, you're absolutely right, nothing has changed. You know. It's all the same, the king is in complete control, it's not very positive. You know. I can even give you some clear examples. So the new constitution of Morocco establishes two types of government, right? Okay. There's something that's called the Council of Ministers, right? This is in the constitution in plain words. So I have it in English here if anyone wants to read it. I also have it in French. So it says that there's something called the Council of Ministers. The Council of Ministers is led by the Prime Minister, and that functions like a normal government. You know, motions are tabled, they're debated, there's a vote, regulations, blah blah blah, that type of thing. Then there's something else called the Council of Government. Okay, the Council of Government is the same government. Everything is the same except the king is there. Okay, and it doesn't say anything about how that functions. Okay, but I can tell you how that functions. Is that when the king is there and the king expresses an opinion, obviously there's no vote. You don't vote if the king expresses an opinion about something. Okay, so end of story. So if you want to know how things have changed in Morocco, the answer is not much. I don't know why in Europe everyone keeps on saying that Morocco is this great liberal country and it's incredible how, you know, democratic the king is, you know, because when you read the constitution it's so clear, you know. And it's really remarkable how all European countries just sing from the same song sheet, right? They all say the same thing, and even a large part of the academic class does the same thing. So a volume was published in France about the new constitution.
Right.
You know, and everyone's just, you know, all of the authors, maybe not all of them, but, you know, a large proportion. We're all very, you know, complimentary, saying, oh, it's really great, it calls for elections and so on and so forth. It's all, you know, and even in terms of ordinary rights, you know, so there's a provision in the Constitution that refers to freedom of expression, okay? And very disingenuously, it says that all Moroccans are guaranteed full freedom of expression, something like that, I'm paraphrasing. But there's no limitation in the Constitution as to freedom of expression, okay? But does anyone here think that you can criticize the king in Morocco? Can you engage in blasphemy? You know, can you insult the police? Can you accuse ministers of corruption? Of course not. No. Immediately after the new constitution was passed, many people were imprisoned for exactly those crimes. You know. So is there freedom of expression in Morocco? Absolutely not. You know. So has anything changed? You know, some improvements. You know, some small details here and there, which are good, but we really need a lot more.